Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar for standard drafters. It's again a webinar that will help you drafting standards for XML. And today the speakers will talk about normative references and in-text citations. My name is Els and I will be moderating this webinar. I would like to inform you as well that you're all muted as usual. You cannot speak out loud, but you can enter your questions in the Q&A panel of this meeting. The speakers will then have a look after the presentations, have a look at your questions and formulate a question, an answer if possible. If your question remains unreplied, don't worry, because we will have a Q&A report uploaded on the website and you will be informed when that report is available for you. Should you be on Twitter, please feel free to talk about us. You have the possibility to use the hashtag training for standards, and you can find us at Standards for EU. So please let me introduce the speakers of today. Amy and Cynthia are both editors in the Standardization and Digital Solutions team, and they're very knowledgeable about the topic of today. So please, Amy and Cynthia, go ahead.
Thank you, Els. Good morning, everybody. So today in this webinar, we'll be discussing normative references and in-text citations. And so within that, we'll talk about the references to other standards, specifically the rules for drafting normative references, so dated versus undated, with some examples from the Internal Regulations Part 3. We'll then look at the styling and layout and the bibliography. We'll then focus on a little bit of clause referencing, so how to lay out your clauses properly, how to style them, figures, tables, and annexes, because there's some special rules surrounding those, and then we'll finish off with a few tips and tricks. And all of this will be geared up to XML, to how you can help us prepare the perfect XML file. So over to Cynthia for the first part.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. So I will cover the part on normative references and also a bit of bibliography later on. So you can move on to the next slide, Amy. So basically, we've divided this webinar into two parts. First, the normative references in non-harmonized standards, and then we'll cover the normative references in harmonized standards later on. So a bit of basic rule first. So you're all familiar with IR3, our Internal Regulation Part 3. So you can see here an extract of the IR3 about the normative references. This is clearly a definition of what should be a normative references. Normative references are references mentioned in the text in a way that it is obligatory to use. It is part of a sentence. In that sentence, there should be a requirement to use that reference. So you can see sentences like connectors shall conform to blah, 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 means that the standard is itself normative. Next slide, please. Another important point when you talk about normative reference is whether to date it or not to date it. So basically, we don't date when we refer to a complete document. We don't date if you don't mention a specific clause or a specific table or a specific figure, for instance, of that document. So you can see again the extract of the IR3. And also below, you have an example of a correct non-dated normative reference. You can see here there is no need for you to add the date because you can use and refer to the whole of the standard. Next slide. Now, if you want to date a reference, you have specific requirement to a part of that reference, then you have to put that date. So again, you have the extract from the IR3. If you want to refer to a specific edition, so there are more than one edition, but this one is the one you want to refer to, you have to indicate the date. Or if you want to refer to a subclause, a figure, a table of that reference, you need also to indicate the date. So you also, again, have the extract of the IR3, and below you have an example. So in this sentence, you want to refer to EN ISO, but specifically to clause 7. So because you want to refer to that specific clause, you need also to add the date of that standard. Next slide. Now we move on to the harmonized standards. Again, the rules are the same as for the non-harmonized standards. We would advise and recommend you to use the same drafting rules as IR3 mentions because they are an essential tool for us and they also apply to harmonized standards. You can, of course, use dated and undated references in a harmonized standards. The only difference, and most of the time the only concern, is related to the commission and the HAS consultant. So if in your TC you decide that you want to use undated reference, please always get in touch with the HAS consultant and check with them whether you can do it or not. Of course, there are specificities in every sector. So we would also advise you to get in touch with your responsible sectorial PM that can help you organize your normative references. If you want more detailed information on these, you can also have a look at the 1010 webinar that was organized earlier on the normative references. You have the link here on this slide. Next slide, please. So back to you, Amy.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. So now a little bit on the styling and layout. So this is quite important for us once you've followed the drafting rules, because if you follow the correct styling and layout, it means that we can prepare an XML file in a much more efficient manner. And that leaves us more time to focus on the content of the standard to make sure that that's the perfect quality. So first of all, clause 2, which is the normative references clause, and this is mandatory even if it's empty. And you can find some information on that in the internal regulations part 3 in clause 15. So the normative references, as Cynthia has mentioned, they need to be normatively referred to in the text, but clause 2 is informative. It's an informative element. You need to list every single reference within clause 2, and you need to use the correct introductory wording too. So you have two options. So if you have numerous documents or even just one document, you use the first example that you can see on the screen. But if you have no normative references, then you use the simple sentence, there are no normative references in this document. And what this allows you to do if you have no normative references is it enables you in the future, if you do have normative references or we identify that there's something there, we then don't have to insert the clause new and then renumber everything, because that causes us a lot of problems, and we can mess up some of the clause referencing therein. So just be aware of that. So the best way to figure out the styling is to use the simple template styles. These are applicable for both CEN and CENELEC. And the styling for clause 2 is really, really simple. So it's just heading 1 for the actual title, normative references. You then have body text for the introductory wording, for either introductory wording. And then for each reference, it should be ref norm. And this it will justify it properly. It will allow us to tag it up properly so that when we create the XML, it's aware that it's a reference. This also allows us to check the standard as well to see that it's not withdrawn, that it's actually published, or that it's somewhere in the publication stage in the process, that it needs to date, that it's even normatively referenced in the text. We have tools to check that quickly. So make sure that it's styled correctly. And just a note, sometimes you may see color tagging, and certainly in some examples within this webinar, we've used some color tagging. This is just for us during processing. It's completely fine. And if you see it while we edit, if we send you a text that contains it that's not yet clean, please don't worry about it. It's purely for us. So when you refer to an undated standard, Cynthia's already shown you a few examples, but the layout has to be how you see it on the screen. So in accordance with EN ISO 14122 Part 4, exactly like that. That's super simple. It's the simplest way to refer to a standard. If you have a clause, a table, a figure, or any addition that you want to cite, it has to be laid out as per the second example. So EN ISO 1422 Part 3, the date 2016, and then the clause, the table, or the figure. If you put the clause or table or figure before the reference, we can't tag it up like this, and we actually can't really see very quickly if you have a very large document that this needs a date. So what we sometimes see at the last minute, and we sometimes pick it up when it's almost a little bit too late, is the fact that this needs to be dated. So please make sure that the clause, table, or reference goes after the standard reference itself. We then have a very special case referring to dated standard with an amendment. So this can be handled in two different ways. So either we have a consolidated amendment, which you can see by the first example, which is EN 16179, 2017. If there's a consolidated amendment that impacts the requirements of the standard, you can add the amendment reference there. So it's plus A1 2019, no spaces anywhere in that reference, just keep it all together. If, however, it's not really impacted by the amendment, or there's a standalone amendment, you can use the footnote. So the footnote should go after the comma in the reference. Sorry. And then the footnote should read as follows: impacted by EN, your reference, and then A1, A2, A3, and the date. So sometimes you may see that the editor's done this. Just make sure that you use the correct one when you're drafting. You sometimes might want to refer to a dated standard with a corrigendum, and you use the exact same principle. So you'll use the footnote element, unless the corrigendum obviously impacts the standard itself. And the footnote reads exactly the same for amendments too. The only difference is that you will have AC. Now there is upcoming something, a change in the rules. So we now won't be consolidating corrigendum officially. So please just be on the lookout for those rules, because they should be coming to you soon. So as I've said, this styling is important because it enables our tools to process very quickly and very cleanly. And it means that we have a lot less to fix when we actually edit, so we can focus more on the content of the standard. It also allows the editor to quickly assess references to withdrawn standards. If it needs to be footnoted that it is under preparation, something like that, we can quickly do that. And it allows us to quickly identify the need for dated references. So that is why we ask you to just make sure you style and lay everything out as you have seen. If you're referring to a standard series, it's a little different. Generally, you don't have a date for this, because obviously if there are multiple parts, you might have multiple different dates. So if you are referring to specific parts or specific clauses, obviously you'll use the dated version. If you want to refer to the whole series, because it doesn't really matter any specific table or figure or anything like that, you can absolutely put series right there. What we do ask is that you don't use series in a harmonized standard. Again, as Cynthia said earlier, you can take a look at that webinar and just familiarize yourself with those rules. If you are referring to an unpublished standard that is foreseen to be published soon, you may or may not come across this footnote. So this is something that the editor might put in if we see that a standard is still under preparation. This is just to keep things a little bit cleaner for us. So the general rule is that you have the publication reference. So as you can see here, we've got EN 17394 part 2, and then we have 2 technical specifications, and all of those are the publication references. And each one has a footnote that just says under preparation, stage at time of publication, and then the actual reference of where it's at now. This allows you to refer to formal vote texts and inquiry texts that are still undergoing preparation. But when it comes to the actual text being published, it's a lot less work, because either you just delete the footnote or you add a date. So you might see this might be a change the editor may make when they edit the text, or you can do it yourself. Okay, back to Cynthia now for bibliography.
Thank you, Amy. So now that we've covered the normative part, which is close to a normative references, we're also going to talk about the more informative part, which are the references mentioned in the text, but they are just there for pure information. So this is the basic rule in IR3. So you can list whatever you want in a standard for pure information for the reader, but those documents obviously cannot be listed under clause 2 because they are not normative, so they shall be listed under the bibliography. Next slide, please. So here you have several examples of a bibliographical reference. So the first bullet point is how it should look in a text. So this example shows you what is actually a bibliographical reference. So in this sentence, you can see that ISOTS is used in an example in that sentence. So you can definitely see that it won't be listed under clause 2, but under bibliography. Underneath, you will see the same reference, but listed in the actual bibliography part of the standard. Again, as Amy mentioned, all the color coding is linked to XStyle, so don't you worry about it. This is something that we do when we edit the text. You might have seen that in one of your documents. That will, of course, be gone by the time the document is published. And the third example is how to reference a bibliographical entry in the document without repeating it over and over again. So you've seen in the second bullet point that you have little numbers in between brackets. Because the bibliography is numbered. So you can put these numbers throughout the text, and XStyles will tag these numbers. And when you go in the HTML and you can click on this little blue number, and it will get you straight to the reference listed in the bibliography itself. So it's all interconnected if it's done properly. And it should be really easy to use when you have the HTML too. Next slide. So we are now moving on to the second part of this webinar, which is about clause referencing in the document. Next slide. So basically, what we see in documents is that you refer to clauses and subclauses themselves, so obviously, but there are ways of referring to these clauses and subclauses. You can't just say, go to this section, go to this sentence. There are kind of some rules in the IR3. So you have here the extract. So basically, if you want to refer to a whole clause, you can say in accordance with, and then you state the clause. If you want to refer to a subclause, please don't use the word subclause itself, or as we sometimes see, paragraph or section. Just use the number. So like details as given in 411. This is also very important when it comes to XML, because then the tool will tag the number. It can be a problem if you have words that the tool doesn't recognize, like subsections, subclauses, or paragraphs. Next slide. So this is how it should look like in your document, and also with the tagging of XML. So you can see the first example in the annex. This is how you should refer to the whole clause, like safety requirements given in clause 4. And you can see the color tagging, that's XStyles does that. And so it's written correctly. So if you click on the link in the HTML, it will get you directly to the clause 4 of the document. And then underneath, you have another example of cross-referencing of subclauses, like you have 453 or you have 4513. This is perfect because there's nothing, there's no word before it, and then XStyle is able to tag it. And again, if you go in the HTML and you click on it, you will be redirected directly to this subclause, which is pretty magical, I think. Next slide. Thank you, Amy.
Okay, so a little bit on hanging paragraphs, because this is something that you can't really directly refer to in the text. So what is a hanging paragraph? Well, as you can see from the example, it's the tiny little bit of text between one clause and a subclause. So as you can see on the left-hand side, you've got uncertainty of the certified value, text between it, and then the subclause 5.1 begins. This is problematic because it is impossible to refer to in the text. And so what you may find is that the editor will change it to general, or if there's already a general clause, we will change it to something else that's similar linked to the text. We will, of course, get in touch with you to tell you that we've done this, because it may be that we have not been able to give it a general clause, and we just want to make sure that what we have done is correct. So we might need your approval for something like this, but we will get rid of these. It causes issues also because if we do have to insert a lot of general clauses, or we have to remove a lot of hanging paragraphs, it can get very, very time consuming. In addition to that, incorrect clause references can be inserted. This is where we haven't really been able to figure out the numbering correctly, because maybe there is anything up to heading 6 in the text, and sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. But not only that, with in-text references too. So citations of clauses that you find within the text, sometimes we can miss them if there aren't very many. So please, 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 where possible, avoid hanging paragraphs, and we can avoid introducing errors to the text. Some exceptions do exist, however, and not all instances of hanging paragraphs need to be removed. So for example, the terms and definitions clause, that is a hanging paragraph between the title and the first term, if you like. But in addition to that, we also have reagents clauses, so lists of reagents that you might have, and the example on screen shows the apparatus clause. These are examples of hanging paragraphs that we will not remove, generally because the list of apparatus or the list of reagents is not really headings. And that is because they are P2, P3, and P4 styling. So for the numbered paragraphs, for example, within a reagents clause or apparatus clause, you would use the numbered paragraph styling, which is P. And this just lets XDALs know that it's not a hanging paragraph and that actually it's a list of something. So as you can see with the examples, we've got P2, which has been used. That's the most common one that we use. Also P3. So the way to use it, if you do need to use P2 or P3 or P4, any text after that can be body text. So as you can see in the example on the right hand side, you've got a nice clean list, but then sometimes you have a little explanation of what each thing is. You can just use body text for that. That's a nice clean way to do it.
So now we are going to cover some of the aspects that might pose us some issues when we edit documents, and also, above all, when we convert to XML. So let's talk about figures, tables, and annexes in your documents. So basically what you can see here are 3 different error messages that we get from our tool Extars when we edit documents. As a rule, we tend to ask you to mention every annexes, every figure, or every table in your document, which means that you have at some point to refer to it in your text. If not, then obviously Xstyle won't pick up and we'll get error messages saying, are you sure this annex is mentioned in the text? Or are you sure this figure should be there? Or are you sure this table is okay? So that's what you can see here on your screen. And that's also why sometimes we get back to you and we say, none of your annexes are mentioned in your text, or you don't refer to your figures at all. Do you want to add something? We can't say that it's compulsory, but we would advise you to. For the reader as well, it's much easier. Next slide. So now we've seen the error message. So how do you make it work? So that's how it should look when it's correct, and with the good tagging as well. So you'll see that for annexes, it's nice if in a subsection of your standard, you have something like it shall be tested in accordance with Annex C. As you can see, Annex C is color tagged, which means that once you have the HTML, you can click on it and you go directly to Annex C. Same goes with the tables. You have the result shall comply with Table 1. And again, color coding, you click on it and you go straight to Table 1. And the same thing for the figures. You can see that figure C1 is color coded green, and you'll get to the figure if you click on it in the HTML. Don't you worry about the difference in colors. This is for us, that's easy. Every annex, tables, and figures, they have special color coding that we know of, and it makes it easier to identify throughout documents. Next slide, please.
Okay, so now for some tips and tricks, just to recap what we've talked about, but also, yeah, just to give you a little more extra information too. So first of all, no directives or regulations or legal text in clause 2. This is quite important. This is something that will be removed where it can block a publication too. It can block a text. So if you do have any normative reference to regulations, directives, or legal texts, just be aware that we will make them informative and then we will let you know. So it's better for you just to make sure they are purely informative before you submit the text to us. If you're not sure, please do get in touch before you submit anything and we can let you know. Then we would ask that you don't refer to conformity assessment standards normatively. So for example, EN ISO 9000 and EN ISO 9001 and EN ISO IEC 17025 and ISO IEC 17000 series. Don't refer to these because they are conformity assessment standards. There are special rules surrounding them. So if you do want to refer to any of these, please do contact your technical PM, your CCMC responsible. When referring to a non-EN ISO or IEC standard, you need to have a TC decision to confirm that there's no European equivalent. So this is a fairly quick process and it just basically says that you're using this, say an international standard reference or some report or something, because there's no European equivalent. Basically, if there is a European equivalent, we would prefer you to use that. And then just a little rule, if the dated reference is used in the text, you have to date the reference in clause 2. So that's something that we also look for while we edit the text. If you have a date in the text, date in clause 2. If there's no date in the text, generally no date in clause 2. That's how it should be laid out. And then we have a little note on normative versus informative, because this is something that people sometimes trip up on. As a general rule, the easiest way to do it is just to have normative shall be according to or shall be as defined in. Shall is the key word. That defines that it's purely normative. It absolutely is obligatory to be used. Shall is the best way to go. If, however, shall doesn't really fit in your sentence, this table in the IR3, I believe it's table 5, this will give you some alternatives. So you have is to be used or is to be according to or is required to. We tend to say stay away from has to be because that doesn't necessarily infer a requirement, and we do tend to change this to shall. So be wary with that. But yeah, you then have normative, informative examples. So again, the easiest way to do this is should be according to or can be according to, something like that, may be according to. But again, that might not fit in your sentence. So we also have alternatives. So is not permitted, acceptable, permissible, is required to be not, is required that something is not, need not, is not to be, that kind of thing. So take a look at this table. And again, if in doubt, get in touch with us because we can always just inform you. The reason why we have this table is to make life easier for the translators. So obviously, some things in native English mean one thing, they might translate slightly differently, but these are all agreed terms that are either normative or informative. So if in doubt, stick to this table.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So very last tips. Please, we've seen all our rules, templates. We have the simple templates. We have the IR3. We cannot say it more often. Please try to stick to our standardized way of writing a standard. Try not to reinvent your text or be too creative with your text, because we have rules, unfortunately. Even though your text might look really good, we'll have to apply these rules to any standards that come our way. So also, we have to insist on the fact that you have to use the simple templates to style references properly. You can also, because there has been a webinar on the simple template previously, you have the link here. If you want to have a look at it, please do so, because it's very instructive. And again, as Amy mentioned, do not hesitate to get in touch with us directly or any other editor if you have a contact point in your sector. If you have any questions while you're drafting your text, we can always help you. We can always attend meetings if you need us there because you don't know how to start writing. Or simply, if you have a random questions, you have no contact point, do send us an email to production@CEN-CENELEC.eu, and the person in charge of that email will forward it to us and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Next slide. So we are reaching the end of this presentation, and please don't hesitate to submit all your questions. We will have a look now and we'll answer as many questions we can. If we don't have time to go through all the questions, or if some of the questions are more specific, we will get back to you anyway by writing. So please let us know which you want us to cover. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so we actually have a number of questions that have come in already, so we'll do our best to provide you with some answers. If we don't respond to your question straight away, it's generally because we need a little bit more time, a bit more specific information, so please don't worry. So the first question that we'll take today is,